The fog clung to the pines like a shroud, whispering secrets through the branches as Emily drove the winding road back to her childhood home in rural Maine. It had been years since she'd set foot in that creaky old house, but the lawyer's call about her aunt's estate left no room for delay. The place smelled of mildew and forgotten time, every corner stuffed with relics from a family she'd barely known. In the attic, amid stacks of yellowed letters and moth-eaten clothes, she found it, the portrait. A stern-faced family from the early 1900s, frozen in sepia tones, their eyes staring out as if pleading for release. But it was the girl in the center, small, wide-eyed, with a delicate necklace dangling from her neck, that caught Emily's breath. The locket seemed ordinary at first, a simple oval of tarnished silver, yet something about its clasp gleamed unnaturally, as if hiding a light within. That night, as rain pelted the roof like impatient fingers, Emily couldn't sleep. She lay in the lumpy bed, the portrait propped against the wall, its gaze following her in the dim lamplight. Then came the voices, soft at first, like wind through leaves, murmuring words she couldn't quite catch. "Find us," they seemed to say, echoing from the darkness beyond the window, where the woods loomed like silent sentinels. She told herself it was the storm, the isolation playing tricks, but deep down, a chill settled in her bones, the kind that warned of truths better left buried. By morning, curiosity had turned to compulsion. She had to know what the experts would say about that necklace, what secret it held that could stir the air itself into speech. Little did she know, the woods were waiting, their mysteries rooted far deeper than any family tree. The old Victorian house stood at the edge of Blackwood Forest, its windows dark and unblinking, as if it had long ago given up on watching the world outside. Harlan Graves, a man whose life had been spent chasing the faint echoes of history and forgotten things, pulled his battered truck into the gravel drive on a damp October afternoon. He had come for the estate sale of Eleanor Whitcomb, a reclusive widow whose family had owned the land for over a century. Most of the furniture had already been carted away, but the attic, the realtor warned, was still packed with whatever the family had chosen to hide from the light. Harlan climbed the narrow stairs slowly, the wood groaning under his weight like an old confession. Dust floated in the thin blades of sunlight that slipped through the cracked dormer windows, catching on cobwebs that draped from the rafters like tattered lace. Trunks lined the walls, their leather cracked and curling, labels yellowed with age. He moved methodically, opening each one with the reverence of someone handling relics, lifting out faded christening gowns, stacks of brittle letters tied with ribbon, and photograph albums whose pages crumbled at the edges. In the far corner, beneath a pile of moth-eaten quilts, he found the portrait. It was larger than he expected, framed in heavy walnut that had darkened almost to black. He dragged it into the center of the attic floor, where the light was strongest, and wiped away decades of grime with the sleeve of his coat. A family stared back at him, father seated, mother standing behind him with one pale hand on his shoulder, 3 older sons arranged stiffly around them. But it was the youngest child, a girl of perhaps 8, who drew his gaze and held it. She stood slightly apart from the others, her small hands folded in front of her dark dress, her expression solemn beyond her years. Around her neck hung a locket, oval and unassuming, its silver dulled by time. Yet even through the grime, something caught the light, a thin, deliberate gleam that seemed to come from within the metal itself, as if the clasp concealed a facet that reflected more than it should. Harlan leaned closer, his breath fogging the glass. The longer he looked, the more the gleam seemed to pulse, faint and rhythmic, like a heartbeat trapped beneath the surface. He had seen hundreds of lockets in his career, hair clippings, miniature portraits, tiny pressed flowers, but none had ever held his attention like this. There was an intentionality to the design, a precision in the way the light fractured across that single point. He ran a thumb along the frame, feeling for hidden catches or seams, but found nothing. Still, the sensation lingered. This was not merely ornament. Something had been placed inside the necklace with purpose, something small enough to hide, important enough to protect. The attic grew colder as the afternoon waned, shadows stretching long across the floorboards. Harlan sat back on his heels, the portrait resting against a trunk, the girl's painted eyes following him with quiet insistence. He knew, even then, that he would buy it, no matter the price. Whatever secret lay concealed in that tarnished silver oval had waited patiently for over 100 years. It had chosen its moment, and now it was ready to be found. Harlan Graves carried the portrait down from the attic as though it were made of glass, wrapping it in an old blanket and securing it in the bed of his truck. Back in his shop on the outskirts of Portland, a narrow storefront cluttered with clocks that no longer ticked and lamps that no longer glowed, he set the painting on the work table beneath the strongest lamp he owned. The girl's locket continued to draw him, that strange inner gleam persisting even under the harsh electric light. He photographed it from every angle, then emailed the high-resolution images to Dr. Lydia Langford, a conservator he had worked with for years, known for her meticulous eye and her refusal to leap to conclusions. 2 days later, Lydia arrived with her portable imaging kit, a quiet woman in her 50s whose grey hair was always pulled back severely, as if to keep distractions at bay. She said little at first, only nodded at Harlan and began her examination. She started with ultraviolet light, then moved to infrared, her gloved fingers adjusting dials with the precision of a surgeon. The room filled with the soft hum of equipment and the occasional scratch of her pen on paper. Harlan watched from the doorway, arms folded, unwilling to interrupt the silence she demanded when she worked. After nearly an hour, Lydia straightened and removed her magnifying visor. Her face, usually impassive, had gone pale. She motioned Harlan closer and angled the monitor toward him. Beneath the infrared filter, the locket's surface, once dull and featureless, now revealed a lattice of fine lines, so delicate they could only have been etched with a jeweller's graver or a diamond-tipped tool. The lines formed symbols, not random scratches but deliberate marks, numbers, tiny and precise, grouped in a pattern that resolved, upon closer inspection, into latitude and longitude coordinates. They were accompanied by a single word, carved so shallow it had remained invisible to the naked eye for over a century: listen. Lydia's voice, when she finally spoke, was low and careful. This wasn't meant to be seen by casual eyes, she said. Whoever engraved this did it under magnification, probably at night, by candle or early electric bulb. The depth variation is intentional, thicker strokes for the numbers, hairfine for the word. She zoomed in further, revealing microscopic crosshatching around the coordinates, almost like a watermark. And these aren't modern GPS degrees. They're in the old format: degrees, minutes, seconds. Early 20th century. Harlan felt the air in the shop grow heavier, as though the dust itself had settled into his lungs. The coordinates pointed to a location less than 10 miles away, deep within Blackwood Forest, on land once owned by the family in the portrait. Lydia traced the numbers with a gloved fingertip, not quite touching the screen. Someone went to extraordinary lengths to hide directions inside a child's necklace, she murmured. And to warn whoever found them to listen. She met Harlan's eyes then, and for the first time in all the years he had known her, he saw uncertainty flicker across her face. The gleam he had noticed in the attic was no trick of light after all, it was the faint reflection of craftsmanship so exacting it had preserved a message across decades, waiting for technology sharp enough to read it. The girl in the portrait seemed to watch them both, her painted lips pressed together as if guarding the secret still. Emily Whitcomb had not planned to return to the house on Blackwood Lane. She had left Maine 20 years earlier, vowing never to breathe its pine-heavy air again, but the certified letter from the estate attorney arrived on a grey December morning in her Boston apartment, informing her that her great-aunt Eleanor, the last of the older generation, had died quietly in her sleep, leaving the property and its contents to the only remaining blood relative. Emily booked the earliest train north, telling herself it would be a quick trip, sign papers, arrange an auction, sell the land, and vanish again before the past could catch her. The house felt smaller than memory allowed, its wallpaper peeling in long, sorrowful strips, the radiators clanking like old bones. She moved through the rooms with clinical efficiency, boxing china and silver for donation, until the realtor mentioned the attic portrait Harlan Graves had purchased months earlier. He paid more than it was worth, the woman said with a shrug. Something about the girl's necklace. The words lodged under Emily's ribs like a splinter. She had seen that painting once as a child, during a rare visit, and remembered only the discomfort of those painted eyes following her around the room. Curiosity overrode practicality. She called Graves, who agreed to bring the portrait back for one evening so she could see it before the house changed hands forever. When he arrived, snow dusting his coat, he unwrapped the painting with the same careful reverence he had shown in the attic. Emily felt the air leave her lungs. The girl in the center was unmistakably her own great-grandmother as a child, Clara Whitcomb, born 1898, the one whose stories the family never told. The resemblance was subtle but undeniable, the same slight tilt of the head, the same wary set to the mouth. Graves lingered only long enough to refuse payment for his trouble, then left her alone with the ancestors she had spent her life avoiding. That first night, Emily hung the portrait in the drafty guest room where she slept, unable to explain why she needed it close. The house creaked around her, settling into winter silence, and she drifted into uneasy dreams of childhood summers spent running from shadows in the bordering woods. She woke abruptly near 3 a.m, heart hammering, certain she had heard her name spoken aloud. The room was empty, moonlight spilling across the floorboards in pale rectangles. Yet the voice came again, soft, childlike, threading through the darkness like smoke. "Find us." It seemed to rise not from the walls but from the painting itself, from the small silver oval resting against Clara's painted throat. Emily sat up, clutching the blankets, telling herself it was wind through the eaves, an old house playing tricks. But the whispers persisted, faint and overlapping, as though several voices spoke at once, pleading in fragments she could almost understand. She turned on every lamp, paced the hallway, brewed coffee she didn't drink. By dawn the voices had faded, leaving only a lingering ache behind her eyes and the portrait watching from the wall, Clara's expression unchanged yet somehow expectant. Emily knew then that the sale would not be quick. Something in the house, in the painting, had been waiting for her return, and it had finally begun to speak. Emily could no longer dismiss the whispers as imagination. They returned each night, clearer now, threading through the old house like cold air through cracked windowpanes, children's voices mostly, sometimes a woman's, all layered and urgent, repeating fragments that dissolved the moment she tried to grasp them. She began keeping a notebook by the bed, scribbling what she could catch. Under the stones, "Don't let him," the clearing. During the day she avoided the portrait, covering it with a sheet, but the voices followed her anyway, faint but persistent, rising whenever she crossed the threshold of the attic or stood too long at the back windows overlooking the woods. Driven by sleeplessness and a growing dread she refused to name, Emily began sorting through the boxes the attorney had left stacked in the study. Most contained mundane records, tax receipts, warranties for appliances long rusted away, but one small trunk, bound in cracked green leather, had been locked. The key, taped inside an envelope marked simply Clara, hung from a ribbon around the portrait's frame, as if someone had intended it to be found together. Inside were letters, photographs, and a slender journal bound in faded cloth. The journal belonged to Clara Whitcomb, the girl in the painting. The early entries were childish, full of pressed leaves and complaints about piano lessons, but toward the end the handwriting changed, tighter, hurried, the ink occasionally blotched as though written in haste or tears. Emily read by lamplight, the house silent except for the tick of the grandfather clock downstairs. Clara described a summer in 1908 when her older brother Thomas, home from university, had become obsessed with something he'd found in Blackwood Forest. He spoke of voices guiding him, of a place where the trees grew in perfect circles, of stones that hummed when touched. The family dismissed it as fancy until the night he vanished. The final pages detailed a search party that found nothing but Thomas's coat snagged on a thornbush near an old clearing. Authorities called it a runaway case, the family called it unspeakable. Clara wrote of overhearing her parents argue late at night, her father insisting the matter be buried, her mother weeping that something in the woods had taken him and would take others if disturbed again. The last entry, dated 3 days before the portrait was painted, read only, "They made me wear it so I would remember to keep silent. The necklace knows where he is. If anyone ever listens, they will hear him calling." Emily closed the journal, her hands trembling. The whispers had grown louder while she read, no longer pleading but almost conversational, as though relieved to be acknowledged at last. Outside, snow began to fall, soft and soundless against the glass, erasing the line between house and forest. The scandal the family had buried wasn't disgrace or debt, it was far older, rooted in the land itself, and the child in the portrait had been entrusted, cursed, perhaps, to carry its directions in silver around her neck. Emily understood now why the voices had waited for her. Blood recognized blood, and silence, stretched across 4 generations, had finally frayed. Emily waited for a break in the January storms, But the snow kept falling, thick and deliberate, as though the forest itself wanted to delay her. Finally, on a morning when the clouds hung low but the wind had stilled, she bundled herself in layers and set out from the back door of the house, the coordinates from Clara's locket memorized like a prayer. She carried a compass, a flashlight, and the journal tucked inside her coat pocket, its pages fluttering against her ribs whenever her heart beat too hard. The path began where the lawn surrendered to pines, a faint indentation in the snow that might once have been a trail. The woods swallowed sound almost immediately. Snow muffled her footsteps, and the trees stood so close their branches interlaced overhead, turning daylight into a bruised twilight. She followed the bearing north-northeast, counting paces the way surveyors once did, checking the compass every dozen steps to be sure the needle hadn't lied. Cold seeped through her gloves and boots, but fear kept her warm, an animal alertness that sharpened every sense. The whispers had been silent since dawn, as if holding their breath. After nearly an hour the ground began to rise gently, the pines giving way to older growth, massive hemlocks and oaks whose trunks bore scars from long-ago lightning. The snow here was shallower, drifted against roots rather than blanketing the earth, and Emily noticed the first anomaly, a circle of stones half buried in the leaf mold, each one no larger than a loaf of bread, arranged with unnatural precision. She stepped over them carefully and felt the air change, growing heavier, charged, the way it does before thunder. Ahead, the land dipped into a natural bowl perhaps 30 yards across, ringed by trees that leaned inward as though drawn by the same invisible force. The clearing was perfectly round, untouched by underbrush, its floor a mosaic of flat stones fitted together like a crude pavement. Snow had settled in the crevices, outlining each one in white, and at the center stood a single upright slab taller than she was, its surface etched with shallow grooves that spiraled inward toward a hollow no wider than a coin. Emily's breath clouded in front of her as she approached, the silence now so complete she could hear her own pulse. She knelt, brushing snow from the nearest paving stones, and saw that they too were carved, simple lines and curves that matched the microscopic crosshatching Lydia had found around the coordinates on the locket. The designs were weathered but unmistakable, repeating in patterns that hurt the eyes to follow too long. When she laid her bare hand on the cold stone, a faint vibration traveled up her arm, not quite sound, more like the memory of sound, the way a tuning fork lingers after the strike. The clearing felt less like a place and more like a held breath, waiting for someone to speak the right word. Emily rose slowly, turning in a full circle, taking in the ring of trees, the spiral on the standing stone, the geometric stones beneath her boots. Whatever had happened here, whatever Thomas Whitcomb had stumbled upon in 1908, had been marked with deliberate care, hidden yet preserved, a message carved into the earth itself. The journal had called it the place where the trees grew in perfect circles, and now she stood inside that circle, the snow beginning to fall again, soft flakes drifting down through the canopy like ash from an unseen fire. The whispers remained absent, but the silence they left behind felt watchful, expectant, as though the clearing had recognized her arrival and was deciding what to reveal next. Emily returned to the clearing 3 times in the week that followed, each visit shorter than the last, as though the place itself were drawing her deeper while warning her away. The snow had melted in patches, revealing more of the carved stones, their patterns sharper now, almost luminous under weak winter sun. She brought offerings at first, a notebook to sketch the spirals, a thermos of coffee to steady her hands, but soon she came empty-handed, compelled by a pull she could neither name nor resist. The silence of the first visit had given way to something else, a low, constant hum beneath the wind, like distant bees trapped inside the earth. On the 4th afternoon, as clouds bruised the sky and the temperature dropped sharply, the voices returned, not the faint whispers of the house, but full and present, rising from the stones themselves. They were clearer here, layered like echoes in a cavern, children's voices predominant, laughing one moment and sobbing the next. Emily stood at the edge of the circle, afraid to cross the ring of smaller stones, and listened as fragments assembled into half-memories not her own, a boy's shout of discovery, the crack of branches under running feet, a woman's plea cut short. The words overlapped, urgent, sometimes addressing her directly, "You came back, don't leave us again," until the air felt thick with presences she could not see. She pressed her palms to her ears, but the voices only grew intimate, slipping inside her skull, showing her flashes of things she had never lived, moonlight on the clearing in summer, figures in Edwardian dress gathered around the tall central slab, a locket passed from hand to hand like a sacred object. One image lingered longest, Clara as a child, tears on her cheeks, being forced to stand still while the necklace was clasped around her throat, her brother's voice faint but unmistakable from somewhere beneath the stones, calling her name. Emily stumbled backward, breath coming in ragged bursts, the forest spinning around her. The voices receded only when she crossed the ring of stones outward, leaving her trembling on the slope, snowflakes melting cold against her burning face. She told herself it was hypoxia, exhaustion, grief resurfacing in hallucinatory form, anything rational, but the images remained vivid, imprinted like photographs behind her eyes. That night in the house the whispers resumed their old pattern, softer, almost gentle, as though apologizing for the afternoon's intensity, yet underneath them ran a new note of impatience. By morning she could no longer concentrate on practical tasks, emails went unanswered, food untouched. The mirror showed a stranger with shadowed eyes and lips parted as if perpetually on the verge of speech. She caught herself answering the voices aloud, arguing with them in empty rooms, demanding to know what they wanted. Reason frayed thread by thread, each tug accompanied by another fragment of borrowed memory. Thomas Whitcomb's terror as the ground gave way, Clara's guilt for staying silent, generations of Whitcombs pretending the woods ended at the property line. Emily understood, with a clarity that felt like breaking, that the clearing had never released its claim on her blood. The voices were not haunting her, they were remembering through her, and soon there would be no difference between their memories and her own. That Emily's nights dissolved into a single, unbroken vigil. Sleep came only in shallow snatches, interrupted by visions that arrived fully formed, as though someone else were dreaming through her eyes. She saw the clearing in seasons she had never witnessed, summer green giving way to autumn fire, then to the bone white of winter, always with figures gathered around the central slab, their mouths moving in rituals older than the Whitcomb name. The voices no longer begged, they instructed, patient and relentless, guiding her hands as she pored over the journal, the coordinates, the infrared photographs Lydia had emailed months earlier. Each clue yielded another piece of the pattern until the picture sharpened into something impossible. One dawn, after a night in which the voices had spoken in perfect unison for the first time, Emily spread every document across the study floor. The cross-hatching around the coordinates, the spirals on the clearing stones, the faint grooves on the back of the locket all resolved into a single sigil when overlaid. It was not a family crest or a surveyor's mark. It was a binding. The journal's final blank pages, held to candlelight, revealed watermark impressions Clara had pressed there as a child, a circle broken at the north, a line threading through it like a chain. Beneath, in pencil so light it had survived only as ghosting, Clara had written a confession. In 1908, Thomas Whitcomb had not stumbled upon the clearing. He had been drawn there by the same voices, believing them to be the spirits of drowned sailors from an old shipwreck legend. But the voices belonged to something far older, something that had waited beneath the stones since the land was glacier-scarred. It had no name in any human tongue, only a hunger for witness. Thomas, eager and scholarly, had performed the gestures it taught him, speaking words he copied from dreams. The ground opened, not dramatically, but quietly, like a mouth, and took him. The family arrived too late to stop it, finding only the locket he had carried for safekeeping, warm to the touch and glowing faintly from within. Horrified, Clara's parents consulted a man from Boston who understood such things. He told them the entity could not be destroyed, only bound, and the binding required a living anchor, someone of the bloodline to wear the sigil and carry the memory of the seal. Clara, youngest and most malleable, was chosen. The locket was engraved under magnification, the coordinates and warnings etched so finely they would vanish from casual view. She was made to stand for the portrait as proof of the family's obedience, a child adorned with her own prison key. The binding held for generations, the entity sleeping beneath the stones, dreaming through the bloodline in whispers too faint to heed. Emily traced the watermark with shaking fingers. The glow Harlan had noticed, the hum she felt in the clearing, it was the binding fraying. The entity had grown patient, learning to wait for a descendant willing to listen fully. It no longer wanted containment. It wanted release, and it had chosen her to speak the words Thomas had begun a century earlier. The voices swelled in approval as understanding settled over her, warm and suffocating, promising that once the circle was unbroken, every trapped memory would flood out into the world, and the woods would finally have their witness. The thaw came suddenly in late February, turning the forest floor to a slick mire that sucked at boots and muffled every step. Emily, no longer able to bear the house's suffocating quiet, drove into town and found Harlan Graves closing his shop early, his face lined with the same unrest that gnawed at her. She told him everything, the voices, the clearing, the binding, her words tumbling out in a rush she could not stem. To her surprise, he listened without skepticism, revealing that he too had heard faint murmurs since handling the portrait, dreams of stones and circles that left him waking with earth under his fingernails. He agreed to see the place for himself, bringing Lydia Langford, who arrived with her equipment cases and a guarded expression, insisting science might yet explain what blood had failed to silence. They entered the woods together at dusk, flashlights cutting pale tunnels through the dripping branches. The air was thick with the smell of rot and renewal, snow lingering only in shadowed pockets. As they reached the ring of smaller stones, the hum Emily knew so well rose to meet them, vibrating through the ground into their bones. Lydia knelt immediately, scanning the central slab with her devices, muttering about electromagnetic anomalies and infrasound. Harlan traced the spirals with cautious fingers, his antiquarian's reverence warring with growing unease. Then the light failed. Not gradually, but all at once, the flashlights dimmed to ember glows, batteries drained in seconds. In the sudden dark the voices erupted, no longer inside Emily's head but surrounding them, layered and discordant, some pleading, others commanding in a language that scraped like nails on slate. Shadows detached from the trees, coalescing at the edge of the clearing, tall, elongated forms without clear edges, reaching with limbs that bent wrong. Lydia's equipment shrieked feedback before going silent. She stumbled back, her rational world cracking audibly in her sharp intake of breath. The ground beneath the central slab rippled, as though something vast turned over in sleep, pushing up clods of earth and pale roots that writhed like fingers seeking purchase. Harlan grabbed Emily's arm, pulling her toward the ring while Lydia froze, transfixed by the emerging shapes. One shadow lunged, brushing Lydia's coat with a touch that left frost blooming across the fabric and drew a choked scream from her throat. They ran then, all three, crashing through underbrush that clawed at their clothes, the voices pursuing in a swelling chorus that shook needles from the pines. They burst onto the old trail breathless and mud-streaked, the manifestations halting at the circle's boundary as though leashed. Behind them the clearing exhaled a sound like distant thunder rolling underground. Lydia, pale and shaking, demanded they leave at once, her scientific detachment shattered. Harlan met Emily's eyes in the fading light, understanding passing between them. The entity had tasted fresh witnesses and found them wanting, yet the encounter had only deepened the entanglement, for now 3 bloodlines carried its echo, and the binding frayed faster with every shared breath. The storm that followed their escape from the clearing raged for days, wind howling through the pines like a chorus denied its finale. Emily barricaded herself in the study, surrounded by the scattered documents, the locket now removed from the portrait and resting heavy in her palm. Its silver had warmed unnaturally since the encounter, the hidden engravings pulsing faintly under her thumb as though alive. Harlan and Lydia had fled to town, promising to research countermeasures, but their calls went unanswered. The voices filled every silence, urging her to finish what Thomas had started. Under the pressure of sleepless nights, Emily pried open the locket's false back, a compartment so cunningly concealed it required a hairpin and steady force to reveal. Inside lay not a photograph or lock of hair, but a thin sheet of silver foil, rolled tight and etched with the complete binding sigil, its lines finer than human hair. Unrolled beneath a magnifying lamp, the foil shimmered, the symbol resolving into the exact pattern carved across the clearing stones, a circle broken at the north, threaded by a chain that looped inward to a central void. Around the edges, in Clara's childish script squeezed between the grooves, ran the full confession. Thomas had not been the victim of blind curiosity. He had sought the entity deliberately, guided by forbidden books borrowed from a Boston occultist who visited the family under pretense of scholarly interest. The man, Clara named him only as the stranger in black, had convinced Thomas that the voices were ancient guardians of lost knowledge, promising power over life and memory in exchange for a simple rite of opening. But the stranger's true intent was betrayal. He needed a sacrifice of pure blood to unbind the entity fully, planning to harness it for himself while the Whitcombs bore the blame. On the night of the ritual, Clara had followed her brother secretly, hiding among the trees. She watched as Thomas spoke the words, saw the ground soften and draw him down, heard the stranger laugh as shadows rose. In panic, Clara fled back to the house, waking her parents with hysterical tales they at first dismissed as nightmare. When searchers found only Thomas's coat, the stranger had already vanished, leaving behind instructions for the binding, delivered anonymously, with threats that the entity would claim the entire family if not contained. Clara's parents, desperate to protect their remaining children, chose the cruelest mercy. They forced 8-year-old Clara to become the living anchor, engraving the locket under the stranger's remote guidance, making her swear eternal silence. The betrayal echoed through generations, parents sacrificing child to save the rest, each descendant inheriting the weight without the truth, the family fracturing into distance and denial to weaken the blood call. Emily stared at the foil until the sigil burned behind her eyes. The entity had twisted the betrayal to its advantage, feeding on the guilt that kept the secret buried. Now, with the locket opened and the confession read, the chain felt looser, the voices shifting from pleading to triumphant. The full secret lay exposed in her hands, not just directions to a prison, but proof of a family's self-inflicted wound, repeated across time in every choice to look away. The moon hung low and bloated over Blackwood Forest the night Emily returned alone, the locket clasped around her neck like a second heart, its silver foil sigil pressed warm against her skin. Harlan and Lydia had begged her to wait, to burn the documents, to flee, but the voices had woven themselves into her bloodstream, promising that only she could end the cycle either by reinforcing the binding with fresh silence or by breaking it and letting the trapped memories flood free. She carried no flashlight. The path unrolled before her in memory, the trees parting as though in recognition. The clearing welcomed her with a hush deeper than any she had known, the air thick and electric, the central slab pulsing with faint inner light that matched the glow now emanating from the locket. Shadows pooled at the edges, taller than trees, their forms shifting between human silhouettes and something older, jointless, vast. The voices rose in a single chord, no longer fragmented but harmonious, guiding her steps across the carved stones until she stood before the slab, its spiral grooves drinking in moonlight. Emily raised the locket, the chain taut against her throat, and spoke the words that had haunted her dreams, the reversal Clara's parents had forbidden, the completion Thomas had begun. The ground trembled, soft at first, then with growing insistence, as though something immense turned beneath it. Cracks threaded outward from the slab, exhaling cold earth and the scent of centuries. Shadows surged forward, brushing her skin with fingers of ice, whispering gratitudes and threats in the same breath. She felt the binding snap like a physical thing, a chain shattering inside her chest. Memories not her own poured through, Thomas's terror, Clara's guilt, generations of Whitcomb denial mingling with her own until identity blurred. The entity rose not as monster but as multitude, every voice it had ever claimed released at once into the night air, swirling around her in a storm of light and sound. Some rushed skyward, free at last, others lingered, pressing close, offering union, promising that if she stepped into the widening fissure she could join them forever, bearer no longer but part of the chorus. Emily stood at the edge, the locket burning white-hot, the clearing alive with movement. One choice would reseal the wound, burying the horror again at the cost of her own voice, her own memories, chaining another generation unknowingly. The other would unleash it fully, letting the woods speak their truths to anyone who listened thereafter, consequences be damned. Wind tore through the trees, carrying distant echoes of Harlan shouting her name from the forest border, too late to reach her. The shadows waited, patient as stone, for her decision.